Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor at large at The Hub. I'm honored to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll cover the first week of the new Trump administration, including its bilateral tensions with Colombia over its deportation plans, and what they might tell us about the administration's foreign policy towards its allies and others around the world. David, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
On the face of it, David, the Trump administration's tensions with Colombia may seem distant from the challenges that Canada is currently facing with Washington. Are there any parallels between the two in your mind? What's your big picture reaction to this story?
The Colombia story is very important because it's almost a perfect lab experiment of the damage that the Trump administration is doing to America's standing in the world. You know, there's a saying in Canada, the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not.
Yes.
So Canada and the United States are bound together by geography. Canada, the United States, and Mexico, to a somewhat lesser extent, are bound together by geography. But more distant countries always have options, and that's something that needs to be kept in mind. That's the moral of this story. So Colombia, you people who have watched Narcos remember it as a land of cocaine trafficking and also Marxist guerrillas. Those two forces tended to overlap and interpenetrate. The Marxist guerrillas did some cocaine trafficking. The cocaine traffickers made tactical alliances with Marxist guerrillas. It was one of the most violent places in the world in the 1990s and early 2000s. And a series of United States governments, starting with the Clinton administration and very much through George W. Bush and culminating with Obama, tried to broker peace between the political factions and tried to reorient the Colombian economy away from drugs to lawful commerce. Colombia is now a huge exporter, for example, of cut flowers, which is Valentine's Day is coming up. Very probably, if you go to an American grocery store, you are buying a product that was living in Colombia maybe 18 hours before, and then was through the miracle of modern information technology and transportation technology brought to you so that you can share it with the people you love. Colombia has also sent some illegal immigrants to the United States, and Colombia is also part of the traffic through into the United States. People all over the world will fly to South America, Ecuador notably, then traverse by bus or other means through Colombia to Panama to get to the Mexican border and then onward toward the United States. So Colombia had a very pro-American government until 2022. And then it's altered to a much more left-wing government in 2022, run by not a kind of rational, value maximizing, but by someone who's borderline mentally ill and has a background with the Marxist guerrillas. But nonetheless, there's so much at stake that he cooperated too with the Biden administration on repatriation. And there were hundreds and hundreds of flights bringing illegal immigrants from the United States back to Colombia. Colombia had a rule, and it became more emphatic under the new president who won in 2022. We need some concessions to our national dignity. That means, for example, we don't want to see lots of shackles on the people. We want these flights to be very quiet, private, and we prefer chartered planes that don't have a lot of American insignia on them. That will help us to cooperate with you. So what does Trump do? He comes in and says, okay, right, we're putting everybody in shackles and we're sending military planes with the U.S. flag all over them, and we're sending two, and we're giving you just a few minutes notice that the planes are on their way. We want to make this maximally insulting. And the Colombian government, again, not disposed to be friendly to the United States, said, no, we're not giving you landing rights. Trump then threatens all of these forms of retaliation. There's a lot of uproar. As I mentioned, Colombia's economy depends heavily on this just-in-time delivery of cut flowers. They buy a lot from the United States too, including cattle, a lot of corn and cattle feed for their beef industry. And Colombia, basically, there's a mutual back down that Colombia accepts the flight. The United States says, okay, we will respect your terms for greater dignity for the people we repatriate, and all is over and forgotten in the United States, but not in Colombia. Because the moral of the story is, again, Colombia has options. It's led by a president who is not disposed to be friendly to the United States. It does have an important internal Marxist left movement that has been brought into the political process. And it has a lot of reasons to be a country interesting to China and other international bad actors. And it's a reminder that the cost of the Trump administration is, I mean, in the end, Trump probably cannot rupture the relationship with Denmark. He probably cannot rupture the relationship with Canada. Those relationships are too deep and big. But the United States' success since World War II has been persuading a lot of countries, including countries with unfond memories of the United States, like many in South and Latin America have, to join the American-led system. Trade, benefit, security, it's better for you. Not because you love the United States so much, not because Colombia has forgotten that what is now Panama and the Panama Canal used to be Colombian territory and was seized by the United States a little over a century ago. They haven't forgotten that. But it's better for them. When Trump changes the terms of the deal so egregiously, people who don't love you need not cooperate with you. And the security costs of that, we should talk more about this, are going to be big in this hemisphere and around the world.
Yeah, well, you mentioned China. I just want to push on that point a bit longer, David. I mentioned before we started recording that a foreign policy scholar friend of mine who actually has some sympathies with parts of the Trump administration's foreign policy said to me this week that this growing antagonism towards allies and others risks isolating America and advantaging China. What could be the consequences of that sort of dynamic?
Well, again, we're not talking here about our real deep friends. We're talking about countries that have options, sub-Saharan African countries, many
Yes.
southern part of Latin America, countries in the Indo-Pacific. So Chinese diplomacy makes an offer, especially in Africa, but everywhere where there are resources, which is we have things to give. We can help you build roads. We can help you build dams. We can lend you money. We can improve your ports as they've done in Sri Lanka. Uh, we don't ask a lot. We don't care if you steal. We don't care if your leaders are corrupt. We certainly don't care if you're a democracy or not. We don't care about human
Yes.
rights. So we have something to give, and we don't ask much in return. Um, Now, the United States can offer more. Yeah, they may not offer the kind of we'll give you the free highway that the Chinese are doing, but the United States, we can integrate you into the whole world trade system, the whole world banking system. We have a lot to give, but we also ask a lot. Our companies are not allowed to pay bribes. Sometimes they do, but they're not allowed to. Our European partners are even stricter on the paying bribes question. We do care about human rights and democracy. Don't do anything too egregious. Um, and we do change policy every 4 years, so it's not as predictable. But we have a lot to give. And that offer has been accepted since the 1990s. But again, many countries that don't love the United States. You know, so long as the United States was facing the Soviet Union, the main area of competition was Europe. You're allied with democracies. You're allied with countries with deep cultural affinity, deep memories of World War II and World War I and the Reconstruction after. To balance China, you have to work with Vietnam, the Philippines, India, Mongolia, um, countries that have very different traditions and histories that are not bound by ties of sentiment, that are themselves often like Vietnam, almost as authoritarian as China itself, maybe even equally authoritarian. And all of these countries are going to be saying, what kind of partner are you? And if the
Yes.
United States says we're unpredictable, we're capricious, we have everything you didn't like about the United States before, we change policy every 4 years, we meddle too much in your internal affairs, plus we offer less of integrating into a world economic system. The United States is going to find itself with a much smaller alliance network, facing for the first time in a long time a geopolitical rival that is economically capable, financially capable, technologically capable, as well as militarily capable.
Let's try to define, David, what we're seeing out of the Trump administration. It's sometimes characterized by commentators and pundits as isolationism, but it's my understanding you don't think that's the right way to think about the Trump administration's pose to the world. How would you characterize this set of actions and provocations?
Well, a country that turns to one of its closest allies, Denmark, and says a territory where the United States and Denmark have cooperated since before the United States entered the Second World War on security, on trade, on many other things. We want to seize that territory from you, rule it against the will of its inhabitants. And if you don't comply, we will punish you economically. That's not isolationism. That's predation. When Donald Trump makes these quote unquote jokes about annexing Canada, which are a little bit like a drunken husband making jokes about beating his wife. Maybe he's not actually going to do it, but it's not comfortable for anybody at the table to hear him make these comments, even if he never does it, because
Yes.
he also may kill her. Um, this is not isolationism. This is a predatory attitude toward the rest of the world.
Hmm.
And it's one in which the United States under Trump is going to approach the world without recourse to, without invoking American values in a way that doesn't make others derisively smile, that offers less, that demands more, and that doesn't see, it's like short-term opportunism that says, we're so busy grabbing Greenland because
Yes.
one of my Mar-a-Lago corrupt golfing buddies has some mining interests there. That we are not seeing, you know what? The United States is very well served by the rule no territorial aggression anywhere on the planet.
There's a view, David, that you've no doubt seen and heard that this Trump administration is more sophisticated than the first one. It has better people and better developed ideas. If so, what are we to make of the Colombia experience and these provocations towards Canada, Denmark, and others? Is this part of some kind of sophisticated strategy, or is there something else explaining it?
Well, let's be more exact about what we mean by sophisticated. Um, this is definitely more technically competent administration. They know how the levers connect to the machinery in a way they didn't understand in Trump 1. So Trump 1 did not understand that if you want to, for example, block an independent counsel, you need not only to sweeten the attorney general, you also have to sweeten the deputy attorney general, because if the attorney general recuses himself, the deputy attorney general, then Trump didn't know that. And that's how he got the Mueller investigation. So he
Yes.
and people around him know that now. Trump 1 was also surrounded by people who thought he was a crazy person who needed to be stopped. Like his
Yes.
top economic advisor, Gary Cohn, famously literally snatched papers off his desk so that Trump wouldn't sign them. So there are no more Gary Cohns. He's got people who broadly want to enable him. But it's not sophisticated in that there's a smart plan here. I mean, let's just go back to the Greenland example. The most unequivocally successful war that the United States has fought from since 1945 was the Gulf War of 1990 against Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. What was that war about? It was about Saddam Hussein annexing a territory against the will of its population. And the United States mobilized a vast international coalition, raised a lot of resources to repel Saddam and uphold the principle no aggression, no territorial aggression by force. Now, Kuwait wasn't a democracy. The government wasn't elected by the people. It was a lot more humane than Saddam Hussein, but the principle was no changing boundaries by force. And the United States fought a war over that in 1990. Now,
Mm.
Trump memory doesn't go back that far, but he has no object. But everyone else remembers, you used to think that that was important. And now you're the Saddam Hussein against Denmark's Kuwait. This world has changed. And even if you're just trolling, what kind of people with the world's largest economy, the world's largest military, they have to be very careful what they say. There are no um, when you're president. Um, you know, I, I, George Bush was a very funny man, George W. Bush, and I wrote some jokes for him. And I remember one of the jokes I wrote was vetoed by Karl Rove personally, and it was such a harmless joke. And I went to Rove to protest. I said that joke was funny, and Rove said the joke was indeed funny. That's why we killed it, because
Mm.
presidents shouldn't be that funny.
Mm.
I thought about that a lot. And it was, the psychologist tells that humor is our response to discomfort. So if
Yes.
something's really funny, that means we were really uncomfortable.
Mm.
So the president, with all that power behind him, unless he has a good, he should always be underplaying it a little bit. You know, uh, this will these actions, foreign government, if continued, may have severe consequences. That's it. That's all you have to say. If you
Mm.
say more than that, you frighten everybody pointlessly.
Your observations about borders and sovereignty, David, remind me of a podcast that we released last week with the U.S. political commentator Henry Olson, who
Yeah.
said that Canadians should be assured that Trump doesn't intend to annex the country, but that he's otherwise indifferent to the niceties of diplomacy or even national sovereignty. We discussed, for instance, the possibility of establishing a U.S. base in northern Canada. What do you think about this idea that national borders just matter less to Trump? And what do you think explains it?
Um, he's a thief. Borders matter less. Other people's property matters less.
Mm.
Uh, women saying no matters less. I mean, he's a predator in his sexual life. He's a predator in his business life. Of course, he's a predator in his economic life. And Henry Olsen, a longtime friend of mine, um, is an example of what's going on. Someone from I have enormous respect, and you want to know who's going to win the Bavarian elections. Henry Olsen is your guy. I mean, he knows more about that. And then after Bavaria, want to know the Turkish regional parliaments. He's
Yes.
following that. He's amazing. But we should not be in the business of saying, you know, that's just Don. He makes jokes about slapping his wife all the time. Doesn't mean anything by it. You know what? Shouldn't make jokes about slapping your wife. And because you do mean something by it. Because if you truly didn't mean it, you would be as horrified by the joke as everybody else.
You mentioned the potential security risks to America as a result of this growing antagonism and, in turn, possible isolation for the country. Presumably, the approach that has governed U.S. foreign policy for the previous decades had its own set of assumptions about the benefits of cooperation
Yeah.
with allies and others. Why don't you talk about the opportunity costs, which could be significant if U.S. policy fails to account for the rationale for longstanding norms when it came to America's relationship with the world?
Yeah. I want to say one thing, which is some people hear this and criticize me for saying, David, there was a lot of hypocrisy in what the United States did. And they did sometimes, play the game more to their advantage. And they didn't respect every border. And while there was usually some fig leaf of international consensus, when they overthrew the drug dealing dictator of Panama, same W. Bush, H.W. Bush, who defended Kuwait, that wasn't exactly respectful of national sovereignty. So I want to make clear here that we're not going to be children about this, but that precisely because the United States has so many international responsibilities and sometimes does have to push the system a little bit. If it's going to have the benefits of not terrifying the rest of the planet and maintaining international cooperation, it always owes some decent respect. And as they said in the Declaration of Independence, some decent respect to the opinions of mankind. Um, and so if you're going to push the rules, you need to make sure that lots and lots of people are on your side and have a broad interest in what you're trying to do. So here are the opportunity costs. As we try to balance China, as we try to compete with China in ways that are peaceful, as we try to avoid conflict, the United States, I think, would win a war with China, but the object is not to win a war with China. The object is never to have one. And to
Yes.
contain China's bad behavior peacefully requires a much greater ratio of strength. Because China will look at Taiwan and may say, maybe we can get away with this if we're just against the United States. But if they know that there's a security structure with India, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, well, it's hopeless. It's just hopeless. So don't even try. Don't test your luck because it's obviously one might work, the other clearly won't. And so to maintain the peace requires more visible strength than to actually to win a fight. And in the nuclear era, we don't want to have any big fights.
The final question, David. We're speaking on January 30th. There are mixed messages out of the administration about whether we could see tariffs on Canada as early as this weekend. How should we understand the conflicting messages, and what should we expect on the tariff front?
There are people in the Trump administration who are trying to use the threat of tariffs for actions that they regard as bureaucratically rational. And then there's Trump who's doing it because he believes in them and thinks they will make America rich and great and powerful. And so and because Trump doesn't work very hard, um, that there's always a balance. But this time he is much more focused on what he wants to achieve. So I'm not going to here predict what will happen. I'm just saying that Canadians who are betting that the restraining factions will win in Trump 2, the way they tended to win in Trump 1, that is a big bet with a lot at stake. And as we have often discussed, I think the operating assumption for any Canadian government is that Trump means it, Trump will do it, and Canada has to be ready. It doesn't mean Canada's defenseless because there are people around Trump who will be aware of the costs of what he's trying to do. As we saw with Colombia, one of the reasons Trump backed off from his threats to Colombia was not just that he was going to raise the cost of Valentine's Day to everybody in the United States, but that Colombia is a huge importer of U.S. corn products to feed its cattle industry. And that's a place where retaliation would fall on some very directly on some very important states that are very important to Trump, the corn exporting farm states. And everybody needs to have these tools. And it's just awful. I mean, this is not the way anybody should be using their bureaucratic brain power. We should be thinking about how do we create enduring structures of peace and security and democracy in the Indo-Pacific under American leadership, but in partnership. And instead, we're having to worry about defending the democracies against the United States and not against China.
David, I said that was the final question, but if you'll permit me, let me just slide one more in to end on perhaps a happier and more optimistic note. A common theme of these conversations now running on almost 3 years has been the enduring benefits of commerce and free exchange. And one of the things that has struck me in recent days in reaction to the anticipated tariffs from the Trump administration is an implicit acceptance in the minds of seemingly virtually all Canadians of the importance of free trade access to the U.S. and the harm done by impediments to accessing the American market. Are we, in a way, David, seeing the decades-long resistance to the notion of free commerce and free exchange essentially defeated in Canada? And is that a reason to feel optimistic, notwithstanding some of the issues that we've been discussing today?
Well, let's hope. I would like to end on an upbeat too, but on this one, I may not be able to because one of the things I'm hearing is more and more revival of people saying the Americans have left us no choice, us being Canadians, us being Europeans, but to revert to the state-led development of the past. And here's the thing that needs to be stressed. When the democratic countries, not the Soviet Union, not Nazi Germany, but when the democratic countries and the semi-democratic countries of Latin America created all the statism, state direction, government control of investment, that was not the reason that Brazil did that in the 1930s or that Great Britain did it in the 1940s and 50s was not because large numbers of people had been convinced that socialism was good. Some people had, but much more they realized that the world trading order that had existed before the First World War had collapsed. It had led to depression, and everybody was on their own. And therefore, this was meant that in places like Brazil and Great Britain and Canada too, that there were a small number of people who really believed in state-led development, allied with a lot of people who thought that's the only workable option. No one's maintaining a free trade system. Britain maintained the free trade system before 1914. The United States has maintained it since 1945. There was a very nasty third of a century in between with two world wars, a Great Depression, Holocaust, communism. And we should have learned our blinking lesson. It's in books. It's in books. You do not have to learn it the hard way. It is in books. Read them. But what did Benjamin Franklin say? Experience keeps a dear school, but fools will attend no other.
A great way to wrap up a comprehensive conversation. David, I want to thank you for joining me, and I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.